Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 334, The Cold War, Part 3. Last time, we covered the first proxy clash, the Korean War, as well as looking into the espionage that was in full gear in the aftermath of World War II through the early 1950s. Today, we will continue the saga that almost began World War III, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and beyond. We're now in the 1950s, and the Red Scare has begun to grip the United States. Stalin is dead, and Nikita Khrushchev is the new leader of the Soviet Union. On February 9, 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy made the claim that the U.S. State Department has been infiltrated by Soviet-backed communists with absolutely no evidence. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invades the South. This starts the Korean War that we talked about in the last episode. It will also stoke the Red Scare from McCarthy. By March 14, 1951, the 38th parallel was set as a defensive barrier to further invasions from the north and incursions from South Korea, which stands to this day. 15 days later, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted of espionage and delivering atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. They would be executed a little over 2 years later. Some debate whether Julius and Ethel were really guilty, but over the years, the evidence has become stronger and stronger that they indeed were. Now back to the U.S. Senate trials led by McCarthy. The Red Scare, as it was called, was an almost 3-year affair, accusing numerous people of being communists and sympathetic to the Soviet Union. He claimed that they had infiltrated not only the U.S. government, but also different businesses, especially the film industry. Many people were blacklisted because they, at one time, may have been to a meeting of the American Communist Party or were outed as pro-Soviet, even if it wasn't true. As for the Soviet Union, they pretty much enjoyed the trials, as they deflected attention from spies who were actually working for them. Now, Senator McCarthy would pass away in 1957 from alcoholism. That same year, the Soviet Union would shock the world when it launched Sputnik 1 and 2. Using the surprise as a tool, Nikita Khrushchev would claim that the USSR had missile superiority over the US and challenging them to a shooting match. American President Dwight D. Eisenhower would respond by calling on the Pentagon to review the nation's defense readiness and urged the American people to build fallout shelters. A month later, the member nations of NATO would meet in Paris for the first time since the organization's founding in 1949. 1958 would be a relatively calm year in the Cold War, with much of the action in the Middle East, including Iraq becoming an ally of the Soviet Union. This friendship would last throughout the Cold War. They, along with Syria, would remain allies of the USSR until its dissolution in 1991. It would also be the year when the Lacey-Zurbuchen Agreement, also known as the Agreement between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics on exchanges in cultural, technical, and educational fields, would be signed. It was a bilateral agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union on various fields, including film, dance, music, tourism, technology, science, medicine, and scholarly research exchanged. Based on the Lacey-Zurbuchen Agreement, Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev would meet at the opening of the American National Exhibition at Sokolniki Park in Moscow on July 24, 1959. They would both argue about the merits of communism versus capitalism in a modern American kitchen. This model would have a debate, and it would be known as the kitchen debate. Now, Khrushchev would scoff at the number of gadgets on display in the American kitchen, calling them kind of redundant and totally unnecessary. He would also say, quote, "This is what America is capable of? And how long has she existed? 300 years? 150 years of independence? And this is her level? We haven't quite reached 42 years, and in another 7 years, we will be at the level of America, and after that, we'll go farther." In September 1959, Nikita Khrushchev would visit the United States. Wanting to visit Disneyland, Walt Disney, a staunch anti-communist, would deny him entry. Instead, the Soviet premier would visit what we now know as SeaWorld. His 13-day trip ended with no agreements to curtail the growing Cold War or limit nuclear-armed missiles. After Sputnik 1 and 2, the U.S. military believed that the Soviets were far more advanced in missile technology than they really were. It wasn't until the late 1950s that they realized they were really pretty far behind the U.S. They found this out through a series of overflights of the Soviet Union by American U-2 spy aircraft. Moscow would complain bitterly about these flights, but Washington simply would ignore them. The American public was told that the Soviets had advanced missiles capable of attacking the U.S. mainland, but in reality, only those in top positions with the U.S. government knew better. This led to a dramatic increase in U.S. military spending. Khrushchev had planned to visit the United States to meet Eisenhower, but the visit was canceled when Soviet air defense forces brought down a U-2 spy plane on May 1, 1960. Its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured alive, although the Americans believed that he had died. They claimed that a weather plane had been lost near the Turkish-Soviet border. When this was revealed to be false, the humiliation of our President Eisenhower was devastating. It caused a meeting between him and Khrushchev, set for 2 weeks later, to be canceled, and it also truly embarrassed America on the international stage. It would also end the so-called spirit of Camp David that had prevailed for the 8 months prior. The world would begin to brace itself for the heating up of the Cold War. With goodwill between the two countries gone, the United States deployed Jupiter IRBMs with nuclear capacities in Italy, putting Moscow within their range in April 1960. In the same year, a number of African countries were freed from French colonial control, leading the U.S. and the Soviet Union to try to gain influence in newly formed nations such as Chad, Gabon, Niger, and Mauritania. 1960 was also famous for an incident that occurred at the United Nations in New York City. Nikita Khrushchev was growing annoyed by criticism of Soviet policies in Eastern Europe. This led him to remove his shoe and pound it on a lectern in defiance. This incident would spark internal rumblings within Soviet leadership about whether Khrushchev was losing it and whether he should remain the leader of the USSR. In early January, days before he left the White House in 1961, President Eisenhower severed relations with communist Cuba. While in office, Eisenhower would have the CIA and military conjure up ways to oust Fidel Castro from Cuba. This would lead to the failed attempt that would be known as the Bay of Pigs operation, which the newly inaugurated President John F. Kennedy would allow to go forward. In Charles Bowell's memoir from, quote, "The humiliating failure of the invasion shattered the myth of a new frontier run by a new breed of incisive, fault-free supermen. However costly and may have been a necessary lesson, it also pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, setting the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The failure of the U.S. military to support the insurgents at the Bay of Pigs emboldened other communist-leaning Latin American revolutionaries to rise up against American imperialism and gave the Soviet Union an open door to influence the movement in South America. In June 1961, the placement of Jupiter IRBMs in Turkey would outrage the Soviets. This was just one of the justifications for the deployment of nuclear-capable missiles to be placed in Cuba the next year. It would also be one of the trading points that the U.S. would use to have the Soviet Union remove its missiles from Cuba the next year. But the big news, though, is that the construction of the Berlin Wall would begin on August 13th, 1961. This was due to an alarming request from East German leader Walter Ulbricht to end the quote-unquote brain drain of highly educated people leaving the country. They thought millions were leaving. The building of the Berlin Wall was the second loss for President Kennedy in the Cold War, with the third coming in 1962, of course, with the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis deserves really an entire series of episodes, so I'll just touch on it today. Before I do, we need to discuss the Vienna summit held on June 3rd, 1961, between President John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. The Soviet premier believed that the U.S. president was a lightweight, a privileged rich boy, so we would treat him as such. According to Vladislav Zubak in his book A Failed Empire, quote, Soviet diplomat Georgy Koronenko was stunned to learn that Khrushchev had said to Kennedy that it was better to let the war start now, before the emergence of new, even more terrible means of warfare. The remark was so provocative that both U.S. and Soviet official transcripts omitted it. Khrushchev's blustering was beginning to worry his Kremlin allies, as well as his Eastern European allies. He believed that it was time to pressure the Americans with nuclear force. As he would tell members of the Presidium in early 1962, quote, we must increase pressure and let our adversary feel that our strength is growing. When some of the members voiced concern, Khrushchev replied, quote, the game is still worth playing. Now, of course, the game he wanted to play would turn out to be the closest the world came to nuclear war. Protecting the communist regime in Cuba was very important to the Kremlin leadership. There was a firm belief that the U.S. would eventually try to invade the island nation, and that time it would likely succeed. The decision was made to place nuclear-capable missiles in Cuba in response to the numerous Titan, Jupiter, and Minutemen missiles that were in Europe, pointing at the Soviet Union. It was Moscow's way to kind of right the balance of power in the world. The Americans were able to spot the construction of launch sites in Cuba in mid-1962. Many in the Pentagon wanted Kennedy to bomb the island and the construction zones, but he wisely chose to take a more passive approach in order to avoid a war. Now, of course, there was no way that the U.S. would allow any missiles to arrive in Cuba, so on October 16, 1962, a naval blockade was begun to stop the approaching Soviet fleet of ships from docking on the island. For the next 13 days, the world stood still, wondering who would blink first. The fear was that the Cold War would turn into a hot one. Khrushchev knew that starting a war wouldn't turn out so well for the Soviet Union, but he had to save face. So on October 27th, he sent a private message to President Kennedy offering a deal whereby the Soviets remove any and all missiles from Cuba if the U.S. would do the same in Turkey. Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, in a meeting with the president's brother Robert, stated that they would remove the missiles, as would the Americans in Turkey, and that the U.S., though, had to guarantee that Cuba would no longer be threatened with invasion. Well, the Cuban leadership, as well as the Chinese, were infuriated that Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership showed weakness, and there was a major defeat for the USSR. This would lead to a fundamental split between Beijing and Moscow. It would also lead to Khrushchev's eventual overthrow on October 14, 1964. Khrushchev would call his old friend Anastas Mikoyan the day after and said the following, quote, I'm old and tired. Let them cope by themselves. I've done the main thing. Could anyone have dreamed of telling Stalin that he didn't suit us anymore and suggesting he retire? Not even a wet spot would have remained where we had been standing. Now, everything is different. The fear is gone, and we could talk as equals. That's my contribution. I won't put up a fight. The Cold War would begin to take a turn under the new leadership headed by Leonid Brezhnev, Alexei Kosygin, and Nikolai Podgorny. Under Brezhnev, repression and censorship across the Soviet Union began, in contrast to the relatively liberal years of the Khrushchev thaw. The Cold War internally would mark the years under Brezhnev, leading to what would be called the era of stagnation. According to Vladislav Zubak, the internal battle would lead to a new phase in the Cold War with the United States, detente. Quote, under Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leadership abandoned reformist projects. It was content to live with a fossilized ideology and sought to repress cultural dissent and force its participants into exile and immigration. Unwilling to carry out domestic reforms, Brezhnev instead launched detente with the Western powers. Detente and the international legitimacy it granted him and the Soviet leadership became a substitute for the Soviet experiment's missing dynamism. At the same time, Soviet participation in the detente process led to further erosion of the Stalinist legacy of xenophobia and to the reintegration of the Soviet Union into a wider world. Well, even under this and detente, proxy wars were breaking out all over the world. The most obvious one was in Vietnam, with the Soviets and Chinese backing the North and the Americans backing the South. In Indonesia, General Suharto overthrew Sukarno, the country's first president. Indonesia switched sides from being friendly with the Eastern Bloc countries to siding with the West, which stimulated foreign capital and investors began entering Indonesia. This was a major blow to the Soviet Union and China, as Indonesia had the fifth largest population in the world in 1967, with 107 million people. Later that year, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson met with Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin in Glassboro, New Jersey, for a 3-day summit. The main focus of the meeting was Soviet-American relations. Earlier in the month, the Arab-Israeli Six-Day War was conducted, and diplomatic contact and cooperation increased, leading some to hope for an improvement in the two countries' relations. Some even hoped for joint cooperation on the Vietnam War. Although Johnson and Kosygin failed to reach agreement on anything truly important, the generally amicable atmosphere of the summit was referred to as the spirit of Glassboro and is seen to have improved Soviet-U.S. relations. This was one of the more important events in promoting detente. In 1968, though, a new president was inaugurated, Richard Milhous Nixon. One of the major issues he campaigned on was being anti-communist. This stance would not be one that would get in the way of reaching agreements with America's Cold War enemies, the Soviet Union and China. In fact, in March 1968, the two communist behemoths would be on the brink of war, with border clashes near the Damansky or Zhenbo Island on the Ussuri or Wusuli River in Manchuria. Clashes also took place in Xinjiang. This border conflict became very close to turning into a full-out war. I cannot understate that possibility looking back at it through the lens of history. The Soviets had even discussed with a number of countries, including the U.S., what their response would be if they attacked Chinese nuclear weapons facilities with tactical nuclear weapons. Well, thankfully for the whole world, both sides decide to negotiate a ceasefire and de-escalate tensions along the border. Now, to understand about this border was set when China was very weak during a period of Russian czars, and they were able to get concessions, forced concessions, that the Chinese felt were, coerced, and they were absolutely right. Now, what this conflict did was further negotiations between China and the U.S., as well as between the Soviet Union and America. The U.S. secretly sent Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to China to meet with their leader, Zhou Enlai, in 1971, during the so-called ping-pong diplomacy. That paved the way for Nixon to visit China and meet with Mao in 1972. As for Soviet and U.S. relations, Brezhnev and President Nixon met on May 29, 1972, in St. Catherine's Hall in the Kremlin to sign a series of documents, with the most important being the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and, quote, the basic principles of U.S.-Soviet relations. This is the height of détente, but it was not met with universal praise. Now, quoting Zubak again, beginning in the mid-1970s, neoconservative critics of the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations attacked détente as an immoral appeasement of Soviet power. They also believed that the Soviet Union used détente as a devious camouflage for its secret plans of global aggression and military superiority. Supporters of détente defended it as the only prudent choice in a world of nuclear terror and as the only means to move toward the reunification of a Europe divided by the Cold War. Even with all the treaties and niceties between the Soviet Union and the United States, there were still many, many proxy wars around the world. A lot of them in Africa. Now, the Kremlin continued to back rebellions in Africa, as I said, also in South America, as well as supporting the North Vietnamese against their war in the South. In 1975, the North finally declared victory over the South, unifying the two countries, which was an absolute stinging defeat for the United States. I remember watching on television, seeing the frightened people of South Vietnam climbing to the top of the U.S. Embassy in Hanoi and trying to get on the helicopters. They were trying to get out any way they could because they knew they would be in trouble when the North came into Hanoi. But the Cold War at this point seemed to be easing, but it would heat up with the arrival of the next U.S. administration, with the election of Ronald Reagan as president. It would be under his administration that tensions between the two countries would once again reach depths reminiscent of the early 1950s Cold War. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time when we wrap up the series on the Cold War. It will take us through the collapse of the Soviet Union and the start of what I believe is a new Cold War between Russia and the West. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.